Graham's final blow. Trump himself is starting to implement his plan against the Kremlin. Putin is furious. The US president has greenlit a major blow to the Russian economy. Moscow is in a panic. The White House is launching the sanctions that Putin feared most of all. The Kremlin's new nightmare. Marco Rubio is changing the rules of the game. Putin is losing Washington. Trump and Rubio are preparing a tough surprise for the man in the bunker. I'll tell you all the details in just a moment. Greetings. This is Ukraine Today. I'm your host, Victoria Perepelitsa, with the latest events. US President Donald Trump will support the passage of a bipartisan bill on secondary sanctions against Russia, initiated by the late Senator Lindsey Graham. This was reported by CNN, citing a White House spokesperson. This decision could become a real nightmare for the Kremlin. Just a few days after Lindsey Graham's sudden death, Trump is supporting his main political project. According to the publication, the path to passing the law is now becoming much easier. We are talking about the so-called sanctions from hell, which provide for the introduction of 500% tariffs for countries that continue to buy Russian energy. For Moscow, this threatens a new round of economic pressure.
This will require both Democrats and Republicans in the Senate, but I hope that we will succeed.
Democratic Senator Richard Blumenthal, a co-sponsor of the bill, said he plans to discuss the final preparation of the document and the timing of its consideration with the Senate Majority Leader, including finding a new Republican to take Graham's place as a co-sponsor. The sanctions package will pave the way for Trump to impose high tariffs on imports from countries buying Russian oil, uranium, and natural gas, with the aim of further weakening Moscow amid its war with Ukraine.
The swift passage of this bill in memory of Senator Graham should be seen as a fitting tribute. That's exactly what we talked about when I last spoke with him over the weekend.
It is noteworthy that after Lindsey Graham's death, Marco Rubio and part of the right-wing camp around Trump could become voices in support of Ukraine in the US. This statement was made by Yuri Rashkin, a former member of the Rock County Board of Supervisors in Wisconsin.
Who is actually going to lobby for Ukraine's interests now? Well, first of all, I think that Marco Rubio, in the end, is not necessarily someone who lobbies for Ukraine's interests, but someone who reminds Trump that you need to be with the winner. And the winner here is Ukraine. It's winning. So at least he's like a sober-minded type. And at the same time, we'll see, because after all, it seems to me that the war party, with statements like those from Laura Loomer, she's an important influencer on the right who has shifted from a pro-Russian, pro-isolationist logic to a pro-war, pro-Israel logic. So now, naturally, she's claiming that the Russians killed Graham. And so there might be pressure now from this whole coalition against Russia and for Ukraine because Ukraine is fighting so well.
The senator passed away on July 11th at his home on Capitol Hill after a brief and sudden illness. According to the preliminary forensic report, the cause of death could have been an aortic rupture caused by arteriosclerosis. Final conclusions will be made after the completion of additional examinations. A few days before his death, Graham visited Kiev, where he met with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. It was then that Graham stated he had coordinated a sanctions package with the Trump administration. Last year, Lindsey Graham stated that Donald Trump had effectively given the green light to the bill. Trump himself also said that he did not object to its progress in Congress. Volodymyr Zelensky expressed his condolences on the death of Lindsey Graham, calling him one of Ukraine's most consistent friends.
Deeply saddened by the news of the death of U.S. Senator Lindsey Graham. Lindsey was a true defender of freedom and the values that make our world a safer place.
The president of Ukraine recalled that during the years of full-scale war, Lindsey Graham visited Ukraine 10 times, consistently supporting Kyiv on the international stage.
In the last week alone, we met twice, actively promoting bipartisan and bicameral support for Ukraine. In recent weeks, he worked on important initiatives that could help bring peace closer, in particular on strengthening sanctions against Russia. We will always be especially grateful for the respect shown to our people and for the courage of our defenders.
Donald Trump also reacted to the senator's death. The US president called Graham one of the most remarkable people he had ever known, emphasizing that America had lost a true patriot.
He always worked hard and was a true American patriot. We will miss Lindsey very much.
While Russian propaganda has for years spoken of the West's inevitable fatigue and the imminent split of Ukraine's allies, signals of a very different nature are beginning to come from the US. People close to Donald Trump's team are increasingly talking about Ukrainian successes and the inevitability of the Kremlin's defeat. And it seems that Moscow is beginning to realize the problem is no longer just on the front lines or in sanctions. The problem is that America increasingly sees Ukraine as a winner, And for Putin, this could be far more dangerous than any new weapons deliveries. More on this next.
Washington is becoming increasingly decisive in siding with Ukraine. A person from Donald Trump's inner circle and former US Special Representative for Ukraine, Keith Kellogg, effectively admitted the situation on the front is changing and not in the Kremlin's favor. Moreover, he explicitly stated that today he would bet on Ukraine, not Russia. And for Moscow, this sounds much more dangerous than another military aid package. After all, we're not talking about a Ukrainian or European politician, but about a man who understands the mood in the Trump camp well. According to Kellogg, for the first time since 2023, Ukraine is beginning to seize the initiative and gain an advantage over Russian troops. And a key role in this is played not only by events at the front, but also by Ukrainian long-range strikes on Russian territory, which are increasingly hitting the occupiers' military infrastructure and logistics. And this is where the most interesting part begins. Kellogg recalled one characteristic of Donald Trump that the Kremlin knows very well but really dislikes remembering. According to him, Trump loves winners, which means that the more success Ukraine demonstrates, the harder it will be for anyone in the White House to convince the US president to see the situation through Moscow's eyes. Moreover, Kellogg effectively delivered a public takedown of those who proposed simplified recipes for peace. He harshly criticized the approach of people who try to view the war as a business deal or a real estate transaction, saying it's not a commercial contract or a negotiation over square kilometers. This is a war in which the future of states and entire regions is decided. It is the successes of the Ukrainian army that could finally change the political atmosphere in Washington. While Russian propaganda has spent months talking about the inevitable fatigue of the West, more and more influential American voices are starting to talk about something else entirely. Ukrainian initiative, Ukrainian technology, and Ukrainian victory. While Russian propaganda has spent months talking about the inevitable fatigue of the West, more and more influential American voices are starting to talk about something else entirely: Ukrainian initiative, Ukrainian technology, and Ukrainian victories. And it seems that Kellogg is far from the only one who has started to look at the situation in this way. In Washington, statements are increasingly being made that are becoming a cold shower for the Kremlin. And if before such assessments could be dismissed as the opinions of individual experts, now they are being joined by people who for many years were at the top of the American security system. Former Pentagon Chief Leon Panetta left no room for double interpretations at all. According to him, Vladimir Putin is not capable of winning this war under any circumstances, and it would be wise for Donald Trump to support the side that will win. And Panetta explicitly named Ukraine as that side. His assessment of the events of recent months sounds particularly telling. After successful Ukrainian strikes on targets in the Russian capital, Putin, according to the former Pentagon chief, has found himself at a dead end and no longer has a clear understanding of how to proceed. And this is quite symbolic. The man who promised to push the war further away from Russia is today forced to explain explosions, fires, and air raid sirens to his own citizens on his own territory. Panetta also points to what the Kremlin tries not to say out loud. In his opinion, the most sensible step for Moscow would be to agree to a ceasefire. But the problem is that Putin is unlikely to want to make such a choice, and this means that Russia will continue to pay an increasingly high price for prolonging the war, economic, military, and political. Even more interesting is the recipe that Panetta proposes to Washington. He's convinced the US must give Ukraine all the weapons it needs to get results on the battlefield. That is, instead of seeking compromises with the Kremlin, more and more influential American politicians are talking about a different scenario, strengthening Ukraine so much that Moscow simply has no good options left. If you compare the statements of Kellogg and Panetta, a rather interesting picture emerges. Different generations of the American political establishment increasingly agree on one thing: Ukraine does not look like the losing side. On the contrary, more and more influential voices in the US are talking about the Ukrainian advantage, Ukrainian capabilities, and the Ukrainian prospect of victory. And this is not at all the signal that the Kremlin expected to hear from Washington. And it seems the Kremlin's main problem now is not just on the front lines. After all, wars are won not only with tanks, missiles, or drones. Wars are also won when the world begins to believe in your victory. If just yesterday Moscow expected Washington to tire of Ukraine, today more and more American politicians, military leaders, and officials are saying the opposite about Ukrainian initiative, Ukrainian strength, and the Ukrainian prospect of victory. And this means that Putin's bet on Western fatigue could turn out to be one of his biggest strategic mistakes, because while the Kremlin tries to convince the world of its own power, the world itself is increasingly betting on Ukraine. And for Moscow, this is perhaps the most alarming signal of all those heard recently.
The geography of the war for Russia is rapidly changing. Zelensky is already talking about a scenario that makes Moscow flinch. Thousands of drones in the sky over the Russian capital. Meanwhile, air raid sirens sounded for the first time in Siberia, and the largest oil refineries are coming under attack one after another. Why are even regions thousands of kilometers from the front starting to feel the breath of war? How is Ukraine methodically striking Russia's fuel and logistics system? Why is the map of a safe Russia literally falling apart before our eyes? Stay tuned.
1,000 drones on Moscow is a death sentence for the Russian Federation. Volodymyr Zelensky has outlined a scenario that the Kremlin would prefer never to discuss. According to the president of Ukraine, the moment of truth for Putin will come when massive drone attacks stop being isolated incidents and become a new reality for the Russian capital. Zelensky is convinced that the decisive factor will be not only the military, but also the psychological effect. When not hundreds, but thousands of drones appear over Moscow at once, the Kremlin will have to look at the war not through officials' reports, but through its own windows. And then Putin's inner circle will start advising him to look for a quieter place to work somewhere far beyond the Urals. And here an uncomfortable question arises for the Russian authorities. If the special operation is going according to plan, then why is it increasingly necessary to think not about new offensives, but about the evacuation of key facilities and the defense of their own capital? It seems the war that the Kremlin planned to keep as far as possible from ordinary Russians is gradually coming home. And the further from Putin from Moscow, the closer, by Kyiv's estimate, the moment when the dictator will have to rethink the entire strategy of this war. Meanwhile, Russia is burning further and further from the front line. Novosibirsk region, a region that for years in Russia was considered almost unreachable by the war, has for the first time declared an air raid alert due to the threat of a drone attack. Such a warning has become an alarming signal for the Russian security system. After all, until recently, residents of Siberia were told that the fighting was happening somewhere very far away. And now the word alert is heard more and more often, even thousands of kilometers from the front. Novosibirsk is not just a large city, it is one of Russia's main industrial centers where hundreds of defense, aviation, engineering and energy sector enterprises are concentrated. It is here that the Chikhalov aviation plant operates, involved in the production of Su-34 frontline bombers, as well as dozens of other strategically important enterprises, without which the Russian military-industrial complex feels quite uncomfortable. The geography of alarm in Russia continues to expand rapidly. While the Kremlin previously convinced citizens that the danger only concerned border regions, now even Siberian regions have to realize that distance no longer guarantees safety. And this is exactly the scenario that has been talked about more and more often in Kyiv lately. The war is gradually reaching places where no one expected to see it, and while Russian officials report on the successful repelling of attacks, Ukraine, step by step, continues its campaign against the oil infrastructure of the aggressor country. In recent months, 9 out of 10 of Russia's largest oil refineries have already come under attack. The strike on the Omsk refinery, Russia's largest oil refining enterprise, caused a particular stir. It is more than 2,500 kilometers from the Ukrainian border. This means that the drones covered a distance that until recently seemed fantastic even to many military experts. If before they felt absolutely safe beyond the Urals, now the very geography of the war for Russia is beginning to change before their eyes. The Omsk refinery was considered one of the key elements of the Russian fuel system. It was on this plant that hopes were pinned to mitigate the consequences of the fuel crisis, which is becoming increasingly apparent after a series of attacks on the oil refining industry. In addition, the enterprise is of critical importance for further oil refining and ensuring the operation of other production chains. It is also symbolic that until recently the Omsk plant remained one of the few large refineries in Russia that had never been damaged. Now that list has become even shorter. And while Moscow tries to explain why air raid alerts are sounding even beyond the Urals, good old Belgorod has also come under fire. Drones struck the Belgorod linear production department of main gas pipelines, as well as infrastructure facilities in the region. The strikes also hit the Belgorod International Airport and energy facilities. And although Russian authorities traditionally try to minimize the significance of such events, the trend itself looks very telling. Under increasing pressure are not only military targets, but also hubs ensuring the functioning of logistics, energy, and the transport system of border regions. Belgorod has long ceased to be a quiet rear for the Kremlin. What was once considered a reliable bridgehead for supplying Russian troops has today turned into a territory of constant tension. Air raid sirens, air defense systems, infrastructure restrictions, all this is becoming the new daily reality for the region. And while Russian propaganda continues to paint a map of an absolutely protected Russia, the map itself seems to be changing right before our eyes. From Belgorod to Omsk, more and more important facilities are forced to think not about development and modernization, but about their own survival. And this is already a completely different reality than the one the Kremlin promised its citizens at the start of the war.
The end of the war is closer than ever. Our forces are squeezing the Russian Federation. Kirill Budanov's statements about real chances of ending hostilities this year have caused a wide resonance, and Western analysts are hinting more openly. Moscow's strategy is starting to fail seriously. Ukrainian production of long-range weapons is changing the rules of the game. World publications no longer believe in a Russian victory. Watch all the details right now. Is the war really starting to move towards its finale? Kirill Budanov's statement has sparked talk about what, until recently, seemed unattainable. Real chances for the war to end as early as this year. According to the head of the president's office, such chances do exist. And although the world is now witnessing a new round of escalation, it is this very thing that could become a prerequisite for future de-escalation and a return to negotiations. It sounds paradoxical, but the history of wars has proven more than once. Very often, parties begin to seek compromises only after they are convinced that their goals cannot be achieved by force. And it seems that Kyiv understands this logic well. While the Kremlin continues to speak the language of ultimatums, Ukraine is ramping up what is increasingly called its main trump card, namely the production of long-range strike weapons. Budanov directly admitted the scale of Ukrainian production has already reached a level that allows for a significant increase in the intensity of strikes on Russian territory. This means that for Moscow, the war is becoming increasingly expensive, not only at the front, but also deep in the rear.
The volumes of our own production have already become decent, let's say, which allows for increased intensity, and intensity allows for achieving certain results.
This is exactly where the scenario that military analysts are talking about more and more begins to take shape. While the Russian army tries to advance, Ukraine is hitting what no army in the world can function without: logistics. Warehouses, supply routes, fuel infrastructure, transport hubs. The task is simple: to make supplying the front so difficult and expensive that every new offensive turns into an exhausting gamble for the Kremlin. The very factors that Moscow considered secondary just yesterday may determine the fate of the war today. While Russian propaganda counts square kilometers on the map, the Ukrainian strategy is increasingly focused on exhausting the enemy's resources. And if this trend continues, the moment when the Kremlin itself is forced to take a serious interest in dialogue may come much sooner than many expect. Therefore, the main question now is this: what will be the real path to peace? Kyiv is making it clear, not through concessions or freezing the problem, but by creating conditions where continuing the war becomes too costly and pointless for Russia. If Budanov's assessments prove correct, the first real outlines of a future peace may appear only after the Kremlin is finally convinced that time is no longer on its side. Russia's inevitable defeat is being discussed outside of Ukraine as well. The influential Western publication Bloomberg effectively admits that the prospect of a Russian victory in the war against Ukraine no longer looks realistic. And this is no longer just the assessment of Ukrainian officials or military experts from Kyiv. Such signals are increasingly coming from the world's leading think tanks, which are closely monitoring developments at the front and the state of the Russian economy. Just a few years ago, the Kremlin was counting on a completely different scenario. But today, even Western observers are noting that the last major Russian offensive has effectively stalled. And the cost of every new kilometer of the front for Moscow continues to rise rapidly. Human losses, production problems, labor shortages, and increasing pressure on the economy are creating a situation for the Kremlin that is hard to hide even behind the loudest propaganda slogans. Moreover, Ukrainian drones and missiles are increasingly reaching oil refineries, energy hubs, logistics centers, and military enterprises inside Russia itself. What was once considered an untouchable rear is gradually turning into a territory of constant risk. This is exactly what, according to many analysts, makes continuing the war much more expensive for the Kremlin than before. The world is increasingly talking not about whether Russia can win, but about exactly how and when it will be forced to agree to a cessation of hostilities. Such a shift in rhetoric speaks volumes. While discussions used to revolve around the possible success of a Russian offensive, more attention is now being paid to ceasefire scenarios and finding a way out of the war. Moreover, the West is already openly discussing not only new aid packages for Ukraine, but also long-term solutions that could finally shift the balance of power. These include tougher sanctions, increased supplies of long-range weapons, new air defense systems, and even the possibility of producing certain defense systems directly in Ukraine. In other words, partners are increasingly preparing not for a compromise on the Kremlin's terms, but for a scenario where Russia will have to accept new rules of the game. The picture for Moscow looks extremely unpleasant. The war, which the Kremlin planned to finish in a matter of days, has gradually turned into an exhausting conflict where time, resources, and international support are not working in Russia's favor. That is why more and more experts around the world are hinting that the moment when the failure of the Kremlin's plan becomes obvious to everyone may be much closer than it seems today. And for Russia, this means only one thing: the room for maneuver continues to shrink rapidly. And what do you think about the latest events? We look forward to your comments. There's more to come. Stay informed on the main news and don't forget to like. Wishing you a peaceful sky overhead.